Most people have heard about the invasion of Hamas into Israel land, but not many know how the tension between these two groups got so bad. Jews and Arabs have been fighting for the Holy Land for hundreds of years, and it all dates back to near the beginning of Judaism, when Moses and Joshua led their followers from Egypt, crossed the Jordan River, and settled in Jerusalem in 1000 BCE. Living in the land at this time were the Canaanites, and they weren't very willing to hand their settlements over to Moses and the Jews. There was a 100-year period where the Israelites took over many of the Canaanite towns, mostly through warfare. The Canaanites were far less technologically advanced compared to the Israelites, and lost many of these battles, leading the Jews to make up a majority of the land east of the Mediterranean. King David's empire was now formed amongst the Jews living in the area, and they would remain in power for roughly 1,000 years, all the way up until the Neo-Babylonians took over in 586 BCE. The Neo-Babylonians burned down the first temple and the entire city of Jerusalem, along with many of the smaller towns surrounding it. The next 1,000 years would consist of many other empires coming into Jerusalem and the Holy Land, burning down the cities and towns, and then rebuilding from scratch with their own new empires. The Holy Land went from the Neo-Babylonians to Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire, to Alexander the Great and the Romans, to Constantine the Great and the Christians, and then finally Islam emerged in the Middle East, and the Muslims wanted their turn at Jerusalem in the year 636. As this land was getting turned over from empire to empire, many Jews were still living in Jerusalem, fighting to return it back to what it once was during the kingdom of David, but they were mostly unsuccessful. Once Islam was formed in the year 610, it wasn't long before this new religion started gaining massive popularity. Just 26 years later, the Muslims overtook Jerusalem, and now the Arabs were flocking to the Holy Land. Muslims were originally tolerant of the Jews, but by the year 1100, the number of Jews here was dwindling. Also around this time, a new group known as the Crusaders came through and once again tore everything down, and this time built churches. The Crusaders would remain here until finally in 1516, enough Arabs were now living in the bordering areas of where present-day Syria, Jordan, and Egypt are, that the new Ottoman Empire was taking over the Mediterranean region. The Ottomans kicked out the Crusaders and, well, regained control of the Holy Land. Now this was roughly 2,500 years of back and forth where a number of empires were all fighting for the Holy Land, but when the Ottomans came in, this is finally where we saw some stability. Jerusalem was one of the many holy cities in the Ottoman Empire that was governed through the city of Istanbul. Churches and synagogues were allowed to stay here, but they weren't allowed to grow or have any new ones built. Nobody had their eyes set out on taking Jerusalem from the Ottomans. That was until the 19th century. A number of messiahs came forward trying to convince the Jews to return to their original Holy Land, which was now called Palestine. This movement was known as Zionism and originated in Europe by a man named Theodor Herzl in 1869. Some Jews accepted Zionism and moved to Jerusalem from Europe, but the Palestinians living in this region weren't very supportive of this migration. It became illegal for Jews to buy land in Palestine, so Jews were often making backdoor deals to find housing and live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was heavily Muslim, but there were some Jews still scattered throughout this region because of these undercover deals going on. Fast forward to the end of World War I in 1917, and the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed, where the Holy Land was now in the hands of Great Britain. The British government wanted to support the Jews, so they signed a letter known as the Balfour Declaration, which promised to establish Palestine as an independent state for the Jews. The letter also stated that nothing shall be done that would restrict the rights of the non-Jewish communities already living in Palestine, but the Palestinians still weren't happy that their land now belonged to the Zionist movement. In the years following, there were many anti-Jewish riots led by the Arabs in this region who didn't want to see the land given back to the Jews, so the British government started walking back on their promise of establishing Israel as an independent Jewish state and created restrictions that would hopefully appease the Palestinians. Jews were trying to move here in massive numbers during the lead up to World War II, given how prevalent anti-Semitism was across Europe. England eventually limited the number of Jews that could move into Palestine to just 75,000 each year in an attempt to not overwhelm the Palestinians. The Zionist ambitions of establishing all of Palestine as an independent Jewish state wasn't going to be easy, and eventually led to violence on both sides. Between 1947 and 1949, at least 750,000 Palestinians became refugees after the Zionists Zionists gained control of 78% of what was Palestine. This new 78% region was now known as Israel, and the Palestinians took refuge in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where these two regions would remain belonging to Palestine. Palestinians wanted more than just the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but they waited to attack until they could build up their military and gain the support of other Arab nearby countries. Finally, in 1967, Palestine had the backing of Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, and went to war with Israel in what was known as the Six-Day War. During the lead up to this Six-Day War, the United States could see that both Palestine and Israel were building up their military personnel along the border and urged both countries to retreat. Neither seemed very receptive to this, so the US sold Israel high-tech weaponry for fear that these Arab countries would work with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This war backfired on Palestine, as it only took Israel 6 days to become victorious, where Israel now had 100% control of the land. Israel had far superior aerial technology than Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Palestine combined, who were far less technologically advanced. The Palestinians were still allowed to live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but now they were under military surveillance and control by Israel. Given the fact that not only had Palestine already given up half of their country's land to Israel, but now Israel also controlled what was left of Palestinian land, this led to the rise of the PLO, which was a Palestinian Liberation Organization. This organization's mission was to end Israeli military occupation in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. A more extreme version to this group arose in 1987, known as the Hamas, which has been labeled as a terrorist organization by virtually everyone other than the United Nations, whose main goal is to fully wipe out Israel and all the Jews. In the 1990s, Hamas started carrying out anti-Israeli attacks in both Israel and Palestine territories. These attacks have ranged from small arms attacks to even launching rockets into Israel land. By September 22, 2005, Palestine and Israel made a deal where Israel would remove their military occupation in the Gaza Strip as long as Palestine would quit firing rockets into Israel. Palestine stayed true to this promise, but in 2007, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from Palestinian Authority in an election. Rockets once again took off into Israeli land, and violence became rampant again. Over the next 16 years, through 4 wars and countless small battles, Hamas only grew more powerful. Each battle, Hamas obtained more rockets that were able to travel further and further. Hamas built a government, a police force, and border terminals with metal detectors and passport control. This continuous strengthening of Hamas has led to today, where they feel as though they have a shot at winning back former Palestinian land and wiping out the Jewish population to top it all off. On the morning of October 7th, 2023, on a Jewish holiday, Hamas in the Gaza Strip breached the border fence and entered Israel through the Kerem Shalom crossing. Hamas then raided a military base just on the other side of this border and started making their way into nearby Israeli towns. Later in the morning, Hamas made their way through the northern border, the Erez crossing, also with not much resistance, and made their way into small Israeli towns. Many hostages were unfortunately taken back into Gaza and lives were lost. Rockets were fired by Hamas, and Israel began firing right back. To make matters even worse, it seems Iran is siding with Hamas and using their military group, the Hezbollah, to fire rockets and artillery into the northern side of Israel. Hezbollah has praised Hamas for their attacks, and have also said that they would not cower even though the US has sent naval ships to be docked close to Iran in the Persian Gulf. Iran has been sending Hamas materials and weaponry through underground tunnels, and ultimately gave them resources necessary to attack Israel. Israel is the far more technologically advanced country, but Hamas has said they are preparing for a long war.